Hey guys, how all of you beautiful people are doing? And yes, this is a next part of Naruto's Shadow Clones Army. WIP An unconscious Iruka forces Naruto to return to the academy for another year. It also marks the beginnings of a prank whose far-reaching consequences will shake Konoha to its foundations. So let's start without any delay. Prank Day 215. As soon as everyone save the Toraisan were out of the cemetery, the clone members launched themselves into action. They threw themselves at the barrier, trying to bypass it by any means, and from every direction. They failed. The barrier was solid like nothing else, and there wasn't a single flaw to be found. A clone even stood on it and jumped repeatedly to no effect. It took a good hour before they found something that worked. Like it had before, the chakra drain technique managed to make a hole in the barrier. It took 6 different clones working in concert to manage that, and even then the hole was no bigger than one's fist. Yamamaya, the clone charged with going through, had to transform himself into a squirrel just to pass. But, once past that, nothing stopped him. Shippo had now been missing for more than 2 hours. Unless she'd fallen asleep, something which the Kichibunshin doubted heavily, it meant that something had happened. And probably nothing good. Luckily, tracking the Jin'er was easily done. She'd lit torches as she'd gone further in, and the dust on the ground made following her footprints easy. To make sure he didn't mess those up, Yamamaya was walking on the ceiling, slowly advancing as he traced Shippo's steps. Following those clearly gained him time. Shippo was ignoring the side rooms, which the clone supposed belonged to other branches of the family, going straight down instead. At the very bottom of the mausoleum was a wide room, with silver coffins not even reaching halfway to the stairs. Compared to the rest of the place, this part was barely illuminated, with a few torches in the end, where the coffins were. As such, Yamamaya generated a small ball of flame above his hand and continued, only to stop not a dozen feet inside. There were a new set of tracks there. He might have missed them if it wasn't for the fact that the 2 pairs of footprints in the dust were one beside the other. The new prints were at least an inch bigger, and spaced differently. He suspected it was a man, but that was a guess more than anything. Shippo had gone straight to the tomb at the very end, which was placed on a dais above the other ones. Yamamaya supposed it belonged to the line's founder. From what little he could see, she'd stopped there in prayer, and that was when the other person had struck. There were surprisingly few signs of battle, only Shippo's dropped torch and the marks in the dust. The clone had no clue if this was because of the man's size or something else, but it seemed there hadn't been much fighting. From that point, it seemed like Shippo had been unconscious, as it looked like she'd been dragged on the ground. That trail was even easier to follow, though it didn't lead very far. It led to another of the coffins a little further down. Like all those present, it was flat on the ground, with a tombstone against the wall describing the man's accomplishments. Shippo's grandfather, Yamamaya noted belatedly, trying to figure out where the tracks led. There was nothing after that. Yamamaya did what Naruto clones did best, and summoned a dozen more copies. The many Kichibunshin then went over the room in detail, leaving nothing unchecked. Careful examination revealed that, compared to the other coffins, this one wasn't flush with its tombstone. It was also quite a bit lighter than the rest. Once that was noticed, it didn't take long for the Naruto clones to find the tunnel underneath. Yamamaya tried to follow it out, but the shield continued underground, and getting 6 clones down in the cramped tunnel to drain the barrier wasn't a possibility. He did light and throw Shippo's torch deeper, just to see how far the tunnel led. It turned out to be not very, since the torch fell a meter short of a ladder. He immediately dispersed himself, trusting in his clones in the chamber above to get the message and disperse as well. Tora needed to know, and pronto. The leader of the Torazen stood, immobile, looking straight at the door to the mausoleum. He couldn't help but go over what had happened and try to find where he had failed. More guards wouldn't have helped, nor better training. Could someone have managed to pass through the barrier by taking a small enough shape and going at the same time as Shippo? He had no clue. Yamamaya's memories then hit the group like a hammer, and the reactions were immediate. Fan out! Tora yelled, looking at the mausoleum and trying to figure out where the tunnel ended. It wasn't too difficult to find. With what little idea they had of the layout, there was really only a single possibility, another mausoleum, this one much smaller, standing a dozen or so meters from the first. There were hedges and trees hiding it partially from view, and it could barely be seen from the Jin Mausoleum's entrance. Unfortunately, this one was better kept, and there were no tracks to be found. Sure enough, the other end of the tunnel was easily located, but nothing more. No hide nor hair of the missing Jin'er, or her kidnapper. Now what? Ryan asked. Tora had to admit he had no clue. Sure, they could field numbers enough that they might be able to go over the entire city, but it would be neither stealthy nor quick. The population would panic once more, and for what? They weren't even sure that Shippo was still in Jincho. They had no clue how long the kidnapping took. By now, their enemies had a 2-hour head start, if not more. No clue, Tora replied. They could have gone anywhere from here. With how many people were in this place, tracking them all isn't practical. We'd need a hint or a trail, at least. The four leaders stood silent for a moment, each trying to figure something out on his own. Anything? Tora finally asked. Hyo and Ryan shook their heads, as nothing had come to mind. The leader turned to Jiga, who hadn't replied. How about you? He asked. There was a moment of silence. I might have an idea. The final clone offered. Prank Day 216. I'm up. Naruto said, shaking sleep out of his thoughts. He then focused on the figure beside his bed. What's happening? He managed to get out. You're needed below in the Uruhara basement, as soon as possible, the clone beside him, a jumper, replied. Naruto quickly slipped out of his pajamas and into his regular orange jumpsuit. What is it? Another attack against our suppliers. Something in Konoha. The clone shook his head. No. The Torazen, the jumper replied, opening the window once more. The Torazen. Naruto repeated, following the clone down the tunnels. The Kichibunshin was clearly in a hurry, judging by the speed at which he advanced, and he had to force himself to keep pace. Then he arrived in the basement proper, and found Iruka already present, in a huddle with a dozen other clones. Along with Ishibo on her head. I'm not that great at it, the rabbit said, lowering his head in shame. I've focused more on fighting than other skills, actually. Okay, what's happening? Naruto said as he reached the group. The clones instinctively made a place for him, giving him a spot opposite Iruka. Shippo's been captured, one of the copies replied instantly. Naruto instantly became serious. Okay. What are the forces we have in the area? He instantly asked. And the Torazen, how many are left? The clone who spoke shook his head. There was no fighting, he answered. She's simply missing, and we have no clue where she's gone. Then what? Naruto started, only to be interrupted. The Toraisan need trackers, Ishibo said. And he was asking me if I could do the job. The rabbit shook his head. I can't, he said sadly. Iruka reached out and scratched him behind the ears. It's not your fault, she whispered. Nobody can do everything. Yeah, Naruto added. We Narutos as a group can't, so that's why we're asking. Who are the best trackers bunnies I could call? He asked, having figured why he'd been woken up at 2 in the morning. Ishibo thought for a moment. You have alcohol? He asked. Naruto simply nodded. The merchant network had more than enough in stock in most places, and at worst they could buy some. Summon the 400, that's your best bet. The 400? Naruto asked at the same time as a pair of clones. Nizagi, Gosagi, and the rest of that gang, the rabbit replied. They're mainly party-goers and pranksters, but they'll do anything for enough alcohol. Have enough brought out and they'll track someone to the ends of the earth for it. Naruto nodded. Right. Can I summon them here or should I go straight to Jin? He asked Iruka's passenger. Summon them there, the rabbit replied. If you call them here, you'll have lost more than half of them before you arrive in Jin. You know best, the real Naruto replied, then made a single clone. You're me until I come back, he said, looking at the newest arrival. Go back to the apartment, and keep to Abisu's schedule. Hopefully, I'll be back soon enough. Hi, boss. The clone said, saluting, before rushing out toward Naruto's apartment. The real ninja turned back to the group. So, who's leading me back to Jin? The jumper who'd woken Naruto up raised his hand. I am, he replied. I'm coming with you, Ishibo added, jumping on Naruto's head. I know how to deal with those drunkards best. The blonde genin wasn't going to complain at having company. Glad to have you, he replied, turning to the jumper. Said jumper turned into a daukshi with a single hand sign, and Naruto quickly followed suit. The two of them were then dashing through the tunnels a second later, and outside in the woods before 3 minutes were done. That way, the jumper indicated, pointing out a direction. Small jumps until we're out of the woods, then we'll see. I know the drill, Naruto replied. He might not have done this before, but he had thousands of memories of how it was performed. In fact, now that he thought deeper about it, he had some images of the cemetery in Jin coming up. Naruto's travel partner replaced himself 100 meters forward, and the, no longer, blonde pushed that thought aside. He'd have enough time to think about this later. Right now was the time for speed, not for introspection. Tora was still in the graveyard itself when Naruto arrived. He hadn't left, not for a minute. The entire place was cordoned off, with guards at every entrance and curtains hiding everything inside, but none of the clones from yesterday's parade had left. They'd simply trained through the night, then through the day afterward. This time, it wasn't out of desire for improvement. It was simply something to pass the time, a way to occupy oneself and not brood over what was happening. He'd done that at first, and it wasn't productive. Getting better was. He'd at least had a breakthrough, and finally managed after days of effort to channel chakra down his sword, and maintain it. It was a surprisingly personal thing, and different for every blade, but having worked it out once meant that it would be easier the next time. And it suggested another reason for a samurai to keep using the same sword at all times. There was still work to be done on that, since he couldn't manage the other things the other members of the Toraisan had said were possible, but it was a start. The sun had just disappeared below the horizon when Naruto touched down, which meant that he'd probably been awake ever since he'd been called. Everything okay? He asked as soon as the boss was present. Naruto simply shook his head. I'll live, he replied, then looked around. You have the alcohol. He nodded and brought out a scroll from one of his pockets. 100 barrels, just as you asked. I have it sealed here, he replied. Better not to draw attention, I thought. Perfect, Ishibo said, dropping down onto the ground. Give it here. Tora looked to Naruto for confirmation, then handed the scroll down when he received it. What now? Where did she disappear? Naruto asked. Inside this place, the Toraisan's leader answered, pointing to the silver mausoleum. But there's a seal around it, so I don't think it makes a good starting point. The mausoleum right to its left, he pointed once more, is where the tunnel under the building comes out. Naruto followed Ishibo there. I suppose I summon them here? He asked. Ishibo nodded. Remember the mental image he pointed out? Yeah. Naruto took a deep breath, then formed the seals one by one. Summoning technique, he said as he slammed his palm on the green earth, and a wave of smoke answered. When it vanished, the two of them were surrounded by rabbits of every color. Well, if it isn't the littlest staff. A brown rabbit, one taller than the rest, sang out. And our newest summoner, no less. Come to see how rabbits have fun. Can it? Ishibo said, staring at the rabbit who'd talked. I don't have time to play around. I've got a good deal for you, and I'm pretty sure you'll be interested. I'm listening, Nizagi answered. I need someone found, and I have 100 barrels of rice wine right here to pay for it, the black rabbit explained, scroll in hand. Whispers rang out in the crowded mass of bunnies. 100. That's enough for. We could party. You know I can't refuse that much, Ishibo the brown rabbit replied solemnly. Who do you need found? Naruto stepped forward at that point. Her name is Jin Shippo, and she was captured by an unknown person yesterday around this time. Tora nodded at that. Her captor used the tunnel down here to infiltrate the sealed mausoleum behind it, and left with her unconscious at the very least. Find her, and all that alcohol is yours. The brown rabbit smiled. We have a deal, he said, then whistled stridently. The mass of rabbits surged forward inside the mausoleum, only to exit seconds later. Some of those, Nizagi included, followed what he supposed was the path the man had taken out of the cemetery, though the rest spread in all directions, noses to the ground. Tora decided to follow the leader of the 400, and was followed by Naruto under a new disguise and a good number of the remaining Toraisan. Surprisingly, they didn't turn toward the city, but toward the mountains instead. Halfway there, however, the bunch of rabbits turned onto a barely visible path going deeper into the forest, and ended up in front of an abandoned mansion overgrown with weeds a few hundred meters from the main road. The summons made a quick check around the building, only to return to the front. I'd have never found this place, Tora said, extinguishing his torch. Behind him, the rest of his group nodded. Unless the guy we're hunting's a ninja, Nizagi said, to the nods of the rabbits surrounding him, he didn't leave of this place. There's also a slight hint of perfume here that I associate with that girl you're looking for. That guy? Tora thought out loud. That means the kidnapper is a man. Nizagi nodded. Sure seems so. He's not alone in there, however. There are a dozen or so distinct scent trails, so he's got help. Numbers aren't an issue, the leader of the Toraisan replied, turning to Naruto. You have your sword with you? He asked. Naruto shook his head. He'd not thought of bringing it, being in a hurry as he'd been. It was still beside his bed, unless his clone was currently using it for training. Then you should go back to the road and point everyone else toward the path. His hands made the usual cross seal. I'll be calling the rest of the Torazen, and you guide them here. You'll be the backup also, in case things fail. You know I don't need my sword to fight, Naruto pointed out. Yeah, but let's keep the illusion for now, Tora countered. We never know when it could be useful, so no need to drop it unless we really need to. Naruto couldn't argue with that. Be safe, he said, walking back to the road. What about our booze? The brown rabbit asked. Should Shippo be found, I will make sure you receive every drop of it, Tora said. Now, however, time is short, and battle calls. Nizaki nodded, and the rabbit group retreated to the trees. Tora turned to the rest of his team. Prepare your swords, people. We have enemies before us, and no clue what cards they could play. Do not hold back, everyone here is guilty of abetting treason at best. Give them no chance to escape or harm anyone else. Hi! The 20 or so Torazen exclaimed. And as one, they marched on the manor itself. A chakra-powered sword meant that the doors offered no resistance to the Torazen, Tora at its head. There had been a few guards here and there, 10 or so, but they hadn't lasted long, not when fighting against 3 to 4 opponents at the same time. The group had checked the upper floor first, to unfortunately no avail, then pushed to the basement hoping to find their target. They found something else first. I was wondering when you'd show up. A blonde-haired man said, his smile an unhealthy grin. He was dressed in something like a butcher's apron, and the blood there only reinforced the resemblance. Outside of that, he was nothing special, 20s, average height, average build, but his eyes grabbed their attention. They were the exact same shade as Shippo's. Beside him, another man stood at attention, a sword sheathed on his hip. Tora scowled, readying his sword. Release Jinsama, or face the edges of our blades. The man simply laughed. Your blades. He repeated mid-laughter. Your blade won't get within 5 feet of me. He turned to the man beside him. Satsuko, does your blade want more blood? Always, Shirobasa-san, the swordsman replied, taking a ninjutsu stance. There can never be enough. I'll leave you to your work, then the blonde said with a smile. My own calls. He said with a sing-song voice, scalpel now in hand. Tora didn't want to think what that man would do with such an instrument. Jiga, beside him, rushed in first, and he followed a half-step behind. Miyamoto had trained the Naruto clones in Kenjutsu, and Iijutsu had been part of it. They knew how it worked, its advantages and disadvantages. And they knew how to profit from those. However, Satsuko drew much earlier than expected. Tora reacted instinctively, tossing himself backwards instantly. Jiga did the same, but not quickly enough. What came out of Satsuko's sheath was more like a whip than a sword. It covered the 15 feet between the swordsman and the Torazen in an instant, and cut Jiga in half where he stood, ignoring the sword the clone had put in front of him. It passed inches in front of Tora's face, then continued to cut a great swath of the wall itself. He then resheathed the blade as Tora rose from the floor. What? What was that? Ryan asked, stepping beside his leader. There are many famous swords around the world, Satsuko said from his Iijutsu stance. And all of them came from somewhere. But, for every famous sword, for every great success, there are 2 or 3 tries that did not go as well. Some are simply lesser failures, but, in the right hands. A great cry then shook the room, coming from further in. None of the Torazen had any doubt who that was. They rushed Satsuko as one. As long as a single one managed to get close enough, they'd win. Once more the sword whip flashed out and cut through the room. Two members of the Torazen struck the blade directly, hoping to block or deflect the sword, but their efforts were in vain. Tora and another Bunshin slid under the blade while Ryan jumped above, as did three of the clones behind him. None of the rest dodged in time. Worse, the blade twisted before it hit the wall, and came straight for those in the air. Dodging without purchase was nearly impossible, and none of those targeted managed it. Forewarned this time, Tora hopped over a third slice, which claimed the other clone at the same time, then kicked off the wall to dodge a fourth. The fifth came right for him. He did the only thing he could think of, forcing his chakra into the right form as quickly as he could. He was rewarded when he felt his feet touch the ground, then prepared for the next attack. It didn't come. A flash step, in midair, even the man said with an even bigger smile. "You're the real thing, clearly. I'd heard that some talented samurai could create after images and illusions of the kind, but I'd have never thought it could reach this level." He waved to the fallen swords on the group, then went once more back in his stance. "You won't be like those no-name Yakuza I butchered, and those worthless mercenaries who think being strong is enough. It will be your skill against mine, and only the best will live to the dawn." He licked his lips. Just what I wanted. This time, Satsuko didn't wait for him to attack, taking 2 quick steps forward before drawing. The increased range meant that there was nowhere for Tora to go, no corner of the room outside of the reach of this whip-like blade. Sure, he could withdraw to the floor above, but that would just delay Shippore's rescue. And that was something Tora would never do. He jumped over the first attack, pushed off to dodge the second, then rolled backwards, avoiding the third. A forward rush took care of the fourth, and a backflip the fifth. Luckily, the now empty room made dodging easier. While the dead clones had left their blades behind, they weren't enough of an obstacle to stop him. Satsuko then sheathed again. Tora wasn't stupid. This was the second time a sixth strike might have ended him, but didn't come. A lesser failure, he'd called his sword. There was something there. Satsuko's blade had barely clicked home before it came back out, faster than before. Tora had expected it, sliding under the first and second strike, then jumping to the wall to evade number 3 and 4. A simple forward roll cleared the last. Then he charged. Satsuko was fast, sheathing and drawing in an instant, but now Tora was close enough to attack. Not for long, however, as the whip blade twirled into a spiral, covering the man. Tora's attack bounced off, and he was forced to dodge back to evade the follow-up. He now, however, had the swordsman's measure. He dodged to the right, as close to the man as possible, then was forced to jump for the wall. 3. Instead of what he'd done before, he pushed straight down from the wall, letting the blade pass to his left. 4. From that point, there was only a single possible angle of attack. Tora rushed to the side, forcing Satsuko's swing to follow him. And 5. At the last moment, he replaced himself on the man's other side, having prepared for that specific scenario even before the last set of attacks. He twirled, swinging his sword straight at the swordsman's head. Only for him to roll under it and dodge. "A nice try, I have to admit," Satsuko replied, his grin still wide. "But you're not the only one who can dodge." His sword, now looking more like an actual katana than the whip it had been, slid to his left. It did not click home. Looking for this? Tora said, showing the sheath within his left hand. The sharp fist was all about making your hands and arms stick to things, and a non-living sheath was a lot easier to manage than living flesh. The swordsman couldn't help but look down to confirm, and that was when Tora had him. He rushed the man right there, and his opponent tried blocking with his now inert weapon. While it wasn't as fluid as before, it was still fluid enough to be useless for such a purpose, and a cut to the upper arm forced him to drop his blade. The next strike, one enhanced by chakra, took off his head. Tora sighed, turning to the door opposite the stairs. He might not have been hit once, but he could still feel the pain everywhere. Some of his dodges hadn't been any good on his muscles, and he was sweating like a pig. And, along with the smell of sweat and blood, there was another that he couldn't identify, but disliked instinctively. Still, he went straight inside. "Done, Satsuko?" Shiraba asked, not even turning as he warmed some tools on an open flame. Tora stabbed him straight through the heart. "Yes, it's done," he growled out. "Tora!" came Shippo's voice from the other end of the room. The leader of the Torazen turned, and nearly vomited at the sight. Shippo was tied to a chair, naked save a pair of panties and a blindfold. It was not her state of dress that turned his stomach, though. She was grievously wounded, her arms, legs, and torso were covered in burns, lacerations, and other, harder to identify, injuries. Some were still bleeding freely, some were burned closed, and there were even places where the flesh was still smoking. Of her visible flesh, only her face and hands had been spared from this torture. The smell of blood filled the room, and he now recognized the odor he'd noticed before. The smell of charred human flesh. "Yes, it's me," Shinsama the clone forced out, trying his best not to let his emotions into his voice. "I didn't break," she said, and it was clear that this was the only thing that had kept her sane. "I didn't let him break me." "No," Tora said, forcing back tears at the image. "No, you didn't. It's over. You didn't break." There was a moment of silence as Tora untied her from the chair as delicately as possible. "It hurts," Shippo finally said. "I know, Shinsama." He looked around for anything that could help. "I'll make sure it gets better." He did find a bottle of anesthetic in the rack at the back. He recognized the smell from Ibisu's medical training. Probably how Shiraba had actually made the kidnapping. "Breathe this in," Tora said, putting the bottle before her nose. "It'll help stop the pain." "That's what the bad man used, isn't it?" Shippo asked, recognizing it. "Yes," he replied. He wasn't going to lie. "It'll take the pain away, and you'll wake up back in your bed." "Good." That was the last word she said, her head falling back a moment later. Tora removed the bottle as soon as she was unconscious, then continued untying her as delicately as possible. Inside, he was raging. Someone would pay for this. Naruto was waiting outside, right next to the building, as Tora came out with Shippo in his arms, covered with a sheet. "Not waiting by the road?" he asked. "I have a clone there," the real one replied. "Reinforcements are on their way." Tora shook his head sadly. "We're already too late." Naruto raised an eyebrow at that. "She's right here, and I can see her breathing." "How are we?" Tora shook his head once more. "You don't want to know." "Better now in the night than getting the memory at the wrong moment," Naruto countered. "Tell me." Tora did one better, and lifted the sheet. The clone saw his progenitor's face flash through different emotions in quick succession. Disgust, giving way to sadness, then to fear. Finally, Naruto's rage overcame all else, his brow furrowed deeply, lips curling back in a scowl. 24 clones appeared around the two so fast that Tora didn't even see the hand sign. They had grim faces, just like Naruto's. "I want this place searched top to bottom," he growled out. "I want nothing left out. Tear it apart if you have to. Nobody gets away with something like that. No one." The clones didn't answer, filing inside in angry silence. Naruto's hands made the cross once more, and this time he kept them there. "I want Tsunade here as soon as possible," he intoned clearly. "I don't care what we have to offer her, I don't care if we have to beg, I don't care what we have to pay. I want her here. Now." The message went out like that, full of rage and pain. Tora felt it echo with his own emotions, and nodded sharply. "What are you gonna do?" he asked. "I'm staying here," Naruto said. "I'm not leaving until this is done. There's nothing in Konoha more urgent than this, and if there is I'll make the trip then." Tora nodded. "As you know, we lost a number of members downstairs. You can take one of their identities until you go back." Naruto stood for a moment, then transformed with a single and seal. "Call me Ryan," he said in the man's characteristic voice. "I'll recreate the rest later." He then walked out, followed by Tora, leaving the clones behind. Shippor needed to get home anyway. Prank Day 216. Naruto's message, carrying his memories and his emotions, hit the many clones like a 10-ton hammer. Unprepared, most stumbled, and it was only luck that no clone doing infiltration burst himself because of that. For Natagama, however, it was a completely different story. Since he was in charge of tracking Tsunade, all the Kichibunshin under his command looked at him for guidance. Unfortunately, it wasn't like he had any better an idea than they did. In the end, there was only a single way he thought it might work. He sent his underlings far and wide, just in case the female Sannin decided to escape, and went straight to the woman. And fell right on his elbows and knees a few meters beside her. She was seated in a private booth in a bar, a high-class one well hidden in a remote alley. One of her favorites, from what he could tell, since unlike her usual methods she'd gone to this particular place 3 times in a row. "So, one of my newest watchers finally decided to show himself," Tsunade remarked, taking a sip from her sake cup. "Did you think I hadn't noticed, even with every other tale I already have?" "I had no doubt you knew," Natagama replied from his place on the floor, saying the complete truth. Based on the other 2 Sannin they'd dealt with, the clones had learned not to underestimate them. "We require your aid, Senju-sama." She put the saucer down, and frowned. "I am not putting one foot in a ninja village, Shinobi-san," she snapped, and no one could miss the disdain she put in the last word. "I am not seeking to lead you back in ninja affairs, Senju-sama," the clone answered, "and the person who requires your aid is among the nobility, not the Shinobi forces." "Ha!" Tsunade exclaimed. Another petty tyrant fearing the smallest sickness. With his eyes to the floor, the clones missed Shitsune's frown at those words. Either that or another one of these old men, wanting to live longer at any cost. "The patient is but a child, and her wounds are the results of torture," Natagama gulped. "Burns, lacerations, and things I do not even have a name for." He bowed lower, as if he was trying to drill his nose in the floor. "I know of no one else who could help. Name your price, and we will pay it. Just say you'll help us." Tsunade took another sip of her sake, then sighed. "1 billion ryo," she finally replied. "Tsunade-sama." Shitsune yelled at those words, rising from her seat. "Done," the clone replied, rising. "You'll have the money as soon as your patient is healed." The Sannin scowled. "You better not be trying to pull one over me." Natagama raised both his hands. "No trick." He then reached into his pockets, and withdrew the scroll he had there. "Consider this an advance, if you want," he added, handing her the scroll. Said scroll contained the results of his last few days' worth of gambling. 2 to 3 million Rio, a drop in the bucket, compared to what she asked, but worth it if it helped build confidence. Tsunade unsealed the money, counted it, and even verified it. Natagama didn't miss this time the look Shitsune was giving her master from the other side of the table. "Fine," she answered with a sigh as she rose. "Count me hired. Now, where is my patient? How fast can you get to Jincho in San no Kuni?" the clone asked in return. That was clearly not what she'd been expecting. "A week," she replied, unsure. Natagama sighed. A clone could make that distance in less than a day, as Naruto had proved handily earlier this morning. But they'd never tried carrying people, and now wasn't the time to take such risks. "It will have to do. Please hurry, I am no medic, and I have no clue if she'll last that long." There was at least one advantage to Tsunade's normal habits: she was ready to go in the next minute. The three of them, and their pet pig, were out of the city barely a moment later, and the Sannin only picked up speed from that point on. While, using the replacement technique, Natagama could beat her speed on land, he couldn't deny that she was much faster than him otherwise. Which was good, since time was of the essence. Prank Day 217. Ibisu could tell there was something wrong with his team. The three of them had barely been working together for an hour this morning, and already the special Jonin could see that the usual team dynamic was off. He couldn't properly say what was causing the problem, however. As such, he kept on. "Maybe you'll all understand it better with a practical exercise," the teacher finally admitted. "Naruto, a dozen clones, if you will." The required number appeared a second later. Ibisu did note that, for some reason, there was less smoke than usual. He simply filed that information in the back of his mind and continued. "Now, you will play the captured enemy," he explained, pointing to a singular clone. "No fighting back, just pretend that you are unconscious." Said clone scowled but nodded, clearly unhappy with his given part. "The rest will be with me as members of the pursuit force. Your role as a team is to escape this training ground with your captive still alive." "You're going to aim at him?" Myoru asked, shocked. Ibisu simply nodded. "Indeed I am. Evidently, the man you captured has valuable information, of the kind that could ruin the entire village's plans. If he is dead, he cannot talk, which is better than him being both captured and alive." He looked at his team, who visibly didn't like what they were hearing. "Unfortunately, missions like this have been given in the past, and will probably be in the future. Such requests are generally handled by ANBU members, but one can never be sure when he or she will find himself on the other side of such a mission." "Right," Iruka resolutely answered with a nod. Ibisu pointed to his left. "Your start point will be the lake at the middle of the training ground, while the clones will accompany me into the forest." He then took an hourglass out of his pocket. "Start when the sand runs out." He clapped. "Places, everyone." The group's first attempt was abysmal, the fake prisoner lasting not even a minute. The second went no better, and neither did the third. The special Jonin couldn't help but find it odd. Usually, his three students were more on the ball, but today was a disaster. He made a clone of himself to handle his role, and decided to watch from afar. From a more remote vantage point, it was evident what was wrong. Contrary to their usual habit, the 3 genin of Team 1 were fighting as if they were each alone. Even the rabbit on Iruka's head was less active than usual, barely moving from his perch. He then looked at the preparations his team performed between matches, and even then there were issues. Compared to the usual, the 3 were nearly silent, barely talking and making no plans. Both Iruka and Myomru, as usual, were looking to Naruto for guidance, but this time the blonde boy didn't rise to the occasion. He simply stood there, as if waiting for something. Then the 3 rose as the hourglass emptied once more, and Ebisu had to act. "Stop!" he yelled, using Shunshin to appear before them. The 3 genin looked at him uncertainly. He ignored them. "Is anything wrong, Naruto?" he asked, lowering himself so his eyes were level with those of his shortest student. "No, no," the boy replied, taking a step back. "Nothing's wrong." His actions spoke differently. "Well, you are clearly not up to your usual level of enthusiasm," the teacher pointed out. "Are you having any issues with this exercise?" He shook his head negatively. Ebisu nearly probed further, then decided that doing so may do more harm than good. His student might be preoccupied with something he didn't want to talk to his fellows about, and pushing probably wouldn't help. He decided to go with something else, then. "Clearly, this exercise isn't working today. Let's shelve it for another time, and focus on other basics." The same basics he was learning once more, from one who'd once been a teammate. 3 laps of Konoha, at marathon speed. 3 groans answered him. Now he counted, and he couldn't help but smile. When the mind is busy, occupy the body. And if the 3 of you aren't done before lunch, each of you will have to do 200 push-ups after that. They groaned again, but quickly started for the wall. Ebisu followed, as a teacher should always teach by example. And it would give him time to think and to study his students some more. Prank Day 219. The forest mansion looked no better when seen by the light of the day. In fact, it was made to look even worse. The state of the walls and windows no longer hidden by the darkness, it looked like it could crumble at any moment. With what the Torazen had found here, Naruto would have preferred never stepping in this place again. But the clones he'd charged with investigating had called upon him, and he was going to get to the bottom of this, whatever the cost. Which meant, right now, dodging between drunk rabbits to make his way in. The 400 hadn't left once done, as he'd expected. Instead of returning, they swarmed the woods around Jin, unsealed all the barrels, and started partying. A party that hadn't ended yet, by the looks of it. Sheesh. Ishibo sighed from his usual position as Naruto jumped over a pair of sleeping summons. "Do you guys know the meaning of moderation?" "Sure we do," a swaying rabbit answered. "It's the reason we ain't going back until we've drank everything." Here. The 200 or so summons currently awake exclaimed. The rabbit who'd talked made a mock bow, did a face plant in the grass, then rose amongst the laughter of the rest of the group. He then jumped straight into an open barrel and did not come out. Naruto could feel Ishibo shaking his head above his hair. "Such a waste," he groaned, and Naruto couldn't agree more. Still, they'd done what had been asked of them, so they had the right to enjoy the rewards. Luckily, the noise outside tapered off quickly once the 2 of them made their way through the doors. There was a clone seated there, one that was probably waiting for them. Status report. Naruto asked, and the Kichibunshin rose instantly. You're not gonna like what we found, the clone warned. I haven't liked anything that's happened in this place, Naruto countered. Better I know if there's another group out there that's coming for us. The Kichibunshin shook his head. At least that's not going to be an issue. Explain. The clone waved for him to follow. You know how we were told there were two rival Yakuza gangs fighting it out? Naruto nodded, with Ishibo maintaining his balance atop his head without issue. Well, that was true, but not completely. There were two groups fighting it out, but that was all part of someone's plan, the clone explained. Naruto waved for him to continue as the three of them descended into the basement where they'd found Shippo. The two groups were the Senketsu and the Kawaii, minor Yakuza families from Tanzakugai, the Kichibushin continued. Unimportant ones, mainly because they were too busy fighting each other instead of trying to grow stronger. They probably would have eliminated each other before long if Shiraba hadn't gotten involved. Shiraba? Naruto asked. You remember the blonde man from the Toraisan's memories? The copy asked, to which Naruto nodded. That was Shiraba. No family name that I could find, though he clearly believed he deserved a specific one. Naruto inclined his head, uncomprehending. The clone took a deep breath. Shiraba was a Jin, technically. Shippo's second cousin to be exact. Naruto's eyes went wide. Yeah, we clones had pretty much the same reaction, the Kichibunshin confirmed. Turns out, Shippo's grandfather liked frequenting brothels and the like. And he didn't believe in taking precautions about it. Naruto might have not had the best ninja education, but sex ed was something Iruka had made certain he'd attended. He got someone pregnant. The clone nodded. Less than a month before he died, yes. Karie was her name, and she gave birth to a daughter. Unfortunately, she didn't live very long, and died before the daughter, Arazan, was 10. And you can guess what happened then. Naruto nodded and scowled. She ended up working in that same brothel. He'd heard about how those places worked. Sadly, yes, the Kichibunshin confirmed. And one thing leading to another, she ended up pregnant herself. The issue was, Karie knew who her daughter's father was, which is why she named her daughter Arazan. And she passed the information on before she died. Naruto grimaced as he started to see where that led. Following the tradition, she named her son Shiraba. Unfortunately, by the time the son was 5, Arazan became infected with the usual kind of sickness that brothels spread, and she was kicked out the door with nothing but her son and the clothes on her back. Let me guess, Naruto interrupted. She went to see the Jin family for help. You got it, the clone confirmed with a sad nod. And you can guess the rest, I suppose. The Jin patriarch sent her away without a yen. Yup, the clone answered as he sat down on a bench. Unsurprising, since like Shiraba and unlike the Jin family, she was golden blonde. She ended up dying from whatever sickness she contracted, and was buried in an unmarked grave in the woods by her son, who swore revenge against the Jin family. Which brings us back to those two Yakuza families the original stated. The clone simply nodded. Shiraba might have been a monster, but he wasn't an idiot. He bided his time, stealing from the Jin graves simply to survive, while planning the rest of the time. Unlike most people, he didn't care how long it took him, as long as he got his revenge in the end. Shiraba was 18 when he met Satsuko, which was when his plan really started. They got on like a house on fire, especially since Satsuko liked killing all the time and Shirobaa didn't care who died as long as the Jin did. With someone to protect his back, he approached both families separately, saying that he was the true heir to the Jin domain, and offering them noble title if they helped him reclaim his throne. And he could prove it. Since he could access the Jin mausoleum, Naruto stated. Exactly, the clone confirmed. He played both Yakuza houses one against the other, pushing them onward by exploiting their rivalry. They took big hits, but little by little they acquired all the power in the region. Only thing that was left was the other gang, Naruto realized. So he set up a situation where they'd fight each other. That's what he did. It was all documented, a final battle between the two clans. They all called on everyone they had that could lift a blade, which was the reason the city was so calm and the citizens so fearful. They saw the Yakuza leave group by group, and knew they would be coming back. But they didn't, Naruto pointed out. The actual battle happened a few days after we arrived in Jin, the clone explained. The Senketsu won, but it was for nothing. Shirobaa, Satsuko, and a few people under him intercepted the wounded remnants of the Senketsu, and killed them off. Shirobaa didn't need them, now that Shippo was the only one left. So, he'd been planning the kidnapping all along. Something like it, yes, the Kichibunshin confirmed. He'd first planned it as a way to exterminate the entire family, with poison or the like, but he wanted more. There's one thing I don't get, Naruto finally said after a moment's thinking. Why torture Shippo? He could have simply killed her, and he'd have had his vengeance. Shirobaa didn't want to kill the Jin, the clone explained with a scowl. He thought the Jin had stolen everything from him, so he wanted to take everything the Jin had in return. His plan was to torture and break the will of one of the Jin daughters, then marry her as her rescuer. He'd wait until she'd given him a child, then she'd have an accident, and wouldn't survive it. He'd then rule over all of Jin. That's sick! Naruto exclaimed. The clone shook his head. You haven't seen everything yet. He rose, then led his creator to one of the rooms past where they'd found Shippo. In here. The room was a simple cell, which clearly hadn't been washed in a long time. The only thing inside was a single open coffin, whose occupant was hidden by a simple sheet. Who's that? Naruto asked. Shippo's eldest sister Kigami, the Kichibunshin pointed out. She wasn't in a coffin when we found her. A horrible realization came to Naruto's mind. You said one of the Jin daughters, which means... He nodded sadly. She was tortured, also the clone confirmed. Much worse than Shippo, too. Shirobaa might have been a good torturer by the time we reached him, but he became that good through experience. You mean... all those other rooms? Naruto asked, afraid of the answer. All cells, each with its own dead occupant. Remember the woman who came to the Kuroniko, asking for barrels of alcohol? Naruto nodded. Ever heard from her again? Naruto thought for a moment. Not that I remember. She's on the opposite side, 2 cells to the left, the clone pointed out. She was one of the few Kawaii who didn't go to fight. Shirobaa had her grabbed because she was a loose end, and because he needed more training at dealing with women. Naruto closed his mouth, trying to stop his lunch from coming up. How many? A dozen bodies, but we're certain there were more. The original took a moment to calm himself. How? He finally asked. How did you get all that? Shirobaa took copious notes, and he had his mother's journal with him. The notes were in code, true, but... Naruto shook his head. Jiraiya had started them on code breaking a few weeks ago, and this was an area where numbers made a difference. He doubted his code had been that difficult to figure out. Anything else? Naruto asked. Well. And that's all we've found, Ryan said from his place at Shippo's bedside. Tora stood at the other, as he had for the past 2 days. It was one of the rare times she was awake, the doctors keeping her out of it as much as possible. They also tended to her wounds and made sure they didn't get infected, but anything more was beyond them. All that, because of the demented plans of a single man, the Jin Lord commented. Yes. It was a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Numbers might be a great force multiplier, but the right man in the right place could accomplish just as much. What about this mansion? She asked. It still stands, for the moment, Ryan replied. We were planning to burn it down as soon as we finished clearing the place. Actually, they were waiting for the 400 to finish with their drunken debauchery and go back home. The clones had already taken everything they needed out, but they didn't want fire anywhere near what was left of the alcohol they'd brought. Good, Shippo sighed. Hopefully, I'll be better soon enough. It wouldn't do to leave my sister without her deserved rest. Shippo had taken that news as well as it could be, actually. She'd long been certain her sister had been among the deceased, and was relieved to know she could be buried with the rest of the family and not left alone to rot unremembered. You should rest yourself, Jin-sama, Tora pointed out from his own seat. You're clearly tired, and you need to recuperate. I've slept more than enough already. The female lord mumbled out. Still, it barely took a minute before she was asleep once more. How long? Tora asked as soon as he was sure Shippo wouldn't hear. His face made it clear he didn't like the delay one bit. 3 more days, Ryan ground out. He didn't like it any better. Shippo had grown on the Torazen, and on Naruto by extension. Seeing her hurt like this, and worst of all trying to present a strong face, only made it more painful to endure. Prank Day 221. Hello, Sensei. The 3 pre-academy students sang out in chorus. Welcome back, students. Ready to learn more? Naruto hadn't expected it, but his lesson on the Kawarimi became the first of many. Konohamaru, Mojai and Udon now met with a clone at least once a week, and they'd always managed to finagle a lesson out of the blonde genin. By their 3rd meeting, he was either sensei or Naruto sensei, and nothing else. And he found that he liked it. The 3 students nodded, clearly eager. Anything in particular? He then asked, though he knew what kind of answer he'd get. More ninjutsu. Konohamaru cried out, echoed by his 2 compatriots not a second later. Again. The clone asked. Didn't you get the lesson last time? And the 4 times before, also? Yeah, I get it, the basics are important. He sighed. But I already can do all of them, and more than well enough. Watch. He then did a perfect pair of normal clones, followed by a mirror-worthy transformation and a textbook replacement. See? I can do them all. The clone couldn't deny that. How about the both of you? He inquired, looking at Konohamaru's 2 followers. The pair did the same exercise right before his eyes. Mojai's replacement was a little slow, and Udon's transformation wasn't all that great, but Iruka would have clearly given those a passing grade. And he could understand feeling like he wasn't learning anything. He'd lived through 3 years of it. Fine, I get it. He finally replied. Tree walking technique. It was another basic exercise that changed everything. Not everyone could fight that easily in 3 dimensions, he'd learned. I already know it, Konohamaru replied. I managed to have Uncle Asuma teach it to me a few months ago. Show me. The boy walked straight up the closest tree without issue, then walked back down. A quick look at the other 2 revealed that they weren't as advanced as their friend. Naruto thought about teaching the method today, but he'd always hated the classes where they went over things he already knew. And he wasn't going to subject Konohamaru to that. Fire candle technique, then. The clone exclaimed. What's that? Konohamaru asked, coming closer. The Naruto clone raised a single finger, a flame popping at the top. That's pretty weak, Udon pointed out. Both the other 2 nodded at that. Maybe, but everyone has to start somewhere. It's the first fire technique I learned, and it helped me a lot when I tried for more difficult ones. Not to mention that it could easily be used seamlessly, as they'd recently learned. Really? Mojai asked, uncertain. The clone nodded wisely. Really? Those who start with the Great Fireball often burn their lips and tongue when they fail. That was one of the comments on the Uchiha scroll they'd used to master generating fire chakra. I don't think you want to try that, do you? The 3 kids shook their heads in unison. Then, let's get to it. Everyone, show me your tiger seal. 3 perfect tiger seals answered him. Very good. Now, the tiger seal is often used for fire techniques, and is the best for this kind of exercise. Now focus on your chakra, and... Unsurprisingly, Konohamaru was the first who managed a burst of flame, and before the hour was done, he could even manage to keep one active for a few seconds. Udon succeeded in a small burst once, but not again, while Mojai didn't even get that. The clone did point out that not everyone had the same affinity for fire, and that Mojai might simply be better at water or earth techniques. He even gave homework, something he'd never have expected. He told Konohamaru that he had until next week to teach his fellow members the tree walking technique, and if he didn't, the next lesson would be on that subject and not on anything new. Judging by the enthusiastic nod he got, he was pretty sure he wouldn't need to teach that particular technique. Still, it brought a smile to his face to see that others wouldn't have to face the issues he did. He'd make sure of it. Prank Day 222. Tsuna didn't know what to think of her current job. On the plus side, she owed money to no one in Jin, and in fact had barely been there once in her life, on a mission with her team ages ago. With luck, she'd be able to gamble the entire payout of this operation over the next few years without having to worry about her debts. On the other side, there were plenty of warning flags attached to this job already. Tsunade had expected to leave her tail behind during the run, but whenever he'd fallen behind far enough, he'd suddenly appear a few hundred meters ahead, still keeping the pace. And she could tell it wasn't a shunshin he employed. Curious. His contacts were also a sticking point. Whenever she decided on a place to stop and stay the night, she'd find a couple of rooms reserved already for her. Which meant that her employer either had rooms reserved in every city along the way, or that he had a method of communication better than most hidden villages. And, most of all, who blew $1 billion Ryo on a healer, even one of her caliber. At least, it seemed her recruiter hadn't lied about the nobility thing. Once in Jin, he led her straight to the mansion at the center of the town, and the samurai standing guard at the gates didn't even stop him. The one at the door was another thing, though. Tall and wide, with long blonde hair in a top knot. visibly, an important member of this group. Finally he exclaimed, then turned to her and bowed. I am Ryan, and a member of the Torazen charged with the security of Lord Jin. Please, come with me. The Lord needs you right away. She exchanged a look with her student, who clearly didn't know any better. I would rather go directly to my patient, she countered. She wanted to be done as soon as possible, and back on her own. Ninjas and samurai and nobility, that was a little too much heat. What was next? Pirates. Yakuza. I am leading you directly to her, the man replied, turning a corner to go down a stairwell. Directly to her ended up in what she supposed was the most isolated room in the building. There were guards at every corner, and some retainers were even standing around in the corridors, just to be close if something happened. One of them, an older man with nothing but grey hair, noticed her escort and ran directly toward him. Is this? He asked. Ryan simply nodded. The man simply threw himself at her feet. Please, Senju-sama. Please save our lord. She. Ryan bent down to put a hand on the man's shoulder. I am sure she will do her best, Getsuko-san. Let's let her work. The retainer suddenly realized he was in the way, and shoved himself to the side. Please? He muttered, his hands clasped in prayer. She didn't say anything, but had to admit she was intrigued. Nobles were usually assholes from what she'd seen, with only a few exceptions. They thought themselves better than the rest, and as such proved that they weren't. But loyalty like she'd seen tended to be harshly earned. The three of them finally arrived at a bed where a young girl was fitfully sleeping. Judging by the twitches she made as she rested, this was clearly her patient. This is Lord Jin, I suppose? She asked, just to confirm. Yes. She stepped forward, taking both heartbeat and temperature. Nothing urgent there. She followed those by a quick scan of her head, which again revealed nothing pressing. She quickly slapped both a pain-blocking and a sleeping genjutsu on the girl, and was rewarded with her falling into a deeper, more restful sleep. Still, she needed to see the rest. Everybody out. She ordered. The few retainers in the room quickly left, but the samurai did not budge an inch. I'm not going to operate on the body of a 10-year-old girl with half a dozen men in the room, she growled. Out. Ryan and the man at the Lord's bedside nodded to each other, then ordered the rest of the men out, who left without a word. They stayed behind, though. That include the both of you, actually, Tsunade huffed, though she couldn't help but respect their moxie. They clearly took this girl's security seriously. We were the two who rescued her. There is nothing here that we haven't already seen, Ryan spoke, brooking no argument. And Lord Jin has ordered me not to leave her side, the other added. Fine, she exclaimed, and removed the sheets in a single move. Well, she couldn't say the man recruiting her had lied. From ankle to hip and from wrist and neck to stomach, the girl was a mass of cuts, lacerations and burns, one atop the other. With all the charred flesh, she at least wasn't bleeding, which meant she could continue with the diagnostic. She also could now see why they wanted someone of her caliber so urgently. And why they were willing to pay 1 billion ryo for the best. Shit soon. She ordered, and her apprentice appeared right beside her shoulder. Get me hot water, bandages, disinfectant, and something nourishing in case she wakes up, because she'll need it. Then find whatever doctors they had here and get me the list of everything they gave her. Hi, Tsunade-sama, Shitsune answered, and she was out of the room just as the last syllable rang out. Tsunade did a deeper scan this time, and noted that the doctors had at least managed to keep most of her wounds from getting infected. There were a few zones on her back that would need to be disinfected, but nothing compared to what it could have been. There was at least nothing urgent, though her breasts and her legs were the most damaged. The rest was mainly superficial, cosmetic damage, which would need treatment but wasn't as big an issue. Whoever had done that to her clearly knew what he was doing. Legs first, then, she said to herself. While this Lord Jin would probably be in bed for weeks, just knowing she could walk around would be a boost to morale. She focused on her hands, and started channeling healing chakra down the girl's leg. She clearly had her work cut out for her. Prank Day 223. Naruto blocked the first blow, then dodged the second. A simple step back took him out of the third's range, and gave him a perfect opening, which he didn't hesitate to take. Point. The clone-playing referee yelled. The two fighters then stepped back. I have not even managed a glancing hit on you yet, Naruto Gaara said with a sigh. Are you sure this is helping? Yeah, the clone said. You are getting better. The worst thing was that this was true. Since they'd started working together on his taijutsu, he'd made large strides forward. His defenses were a lot tighter, his attacks flowing better, and even his speed had improved. It did help that Gaara had pulled another trick from his bag. He'd come one day with large gauntlets made out of sand, copied from another sandjnin. Normally, something like that impaired the practitioner and required quite a bit of training, but Gaara's sand control made that a non-issue. No, the main problem was that Gaara was too mechanical in his fighting. He followed the academy katas he'd been taught to the letter, not deviating in the least from the pattern. While this didn't cause much of an issue on the defensive side, his attacks were uninspired and easily anticipated. And then dodged. You just need to be more creative in your attacks. Right now, you're too easy to predict, and that's a big flaw, the Naruto clone continued. I'd recommend finding other styles and incorporating what works for you in your own personal style. Gaara nodded, letting his gauntlets crumble into desert sand. He wasn't even winded, even though the two of them had been training for the past hour. Apart from that, exercise, 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 the Kichibunshin pointed out. You're still slower than you should be, and there's unfortunately no two ways to go about it. Gaara sighed again. Is there not something that would give faster results? The Naruto clone raised an eyebrow. That wasn't like Gaara at all. The Ichibi Jinchuriki had only been training his sand before Naruto had arrived in Suna, and that was more because he found such exercises restful than anything else. Something was clearly up. That's not the way you usually think, Naruto pointed out. Why the sudden change? Gaara lowered his head. I was sure you would pick up on it, he sighed. He then sat down. Ever since the captured Sand Ninja returned from Konoha, the Suna Council has been planning and preparing to select a new Kazekage. I found out yesterday from Baki that I am on the short list of those who might get the post, and a number of the others on the list are clearly not interested in this rank. The Naruto clone's eyes went wide. Really? Congratulations, he said, clapping Gaara on the shoulder. You do not mind? The Sand Genin asked. Why would I? Being leader of your own village has been your dream, from what you have said repeatedly, Gaara explained. I was afraid you would take it badly that someone as young as you achieved the same before you did. Naruto shook his head. I'm not in the same situation as you are. The current Hokage is still alive, and I wouldn't want anything to happen to him just so I could have a chance at the job. And I suppose the fact that you're the son of the previous Kazekage had some impact, am I right? Gaara nodded. The traditionalists are very much on my side because of exactly that. Also, the fact that my father's magnet release and my sand control have similar uses reinforces that link. Well, the clone said, that's clearly not an advantage I have. Given that the last two Hokages weren't of the same family line, I'm not too worried by the blood issue. And anyway, I want to be chosen for the role by everyone through my own merits and not because of whom I was related to. No offense. None taken, Gaara said with a slight smile. There was a moment of silence as Naruto thought. So, you're planning on taking the role if it's offered to you, and you want to make sure you're ready for it, correct? The Sand Genin nodded. I want to prove that what I am right now is not all I can be. Most of the other candidates are much older, and I want to show that even as young as I am, I can still compete with them. Naruto nodded sagely. He understood the feeling very well. So, something that could be learned quickly. That ruled Taijutsu out completely, given that it was endless rote repetition that had an impact in that domain. Genjutsu might have been a possibility, but Naruto only knew a single one of those, and not one that would be useful for a Kage. Ninjutsu it was going to have to be. The Kijibunshin technique would have helped in this situation, but it turned out that Gaara couldn't use it. Sure, he could perform the jutsu perfectly, but each clone Gaara generated reflexively armored himself in its own sand skin, which was unfortunately enough interference to force it to dispel. It was still a work in progress. Naruto then turned his thoughts towards Gaara's sand. It was what the Ichibi Jinchuriki could use the most easily, and new ways to fight with it could very well help them in a relatively short amount of time. Let's focus on your sand then, the clone said, and Gaara straightened. How well can you feel through your sand? I can feel every single step your clones are taking back there, Gaara explained, pointing. I have never measured my range exactly, but I know it is more than a kilometer. That was pretty epic, Naruto had to admit. How about when it's in the air? Like in a sandstorm or something? Gaara's face turned pensive. I have to say I am not sure, he finally replied. Then let's try. Naruto exclaimed. It turned out that, yes, Gaara could feel someone in a sandstorm. It wasn't as efficient as his normal sand sense, but it was more than good enough for valid targeting. The next hour was spent refining that. Gaara maintained a cloud of sand 20 meters wide, and Naruto sent in clones from various directions. Before the hour was halfway done, none of the clones got in more than a meter deep without getting hit by a sand bullet. And that only got better as time went on. Then Naruto had another idea. How about a sand tornado? The clones had to perform one themselves to provide an example, but Gaara picked it up pretty quickly. It was also, based on his words, pretty tiring. Keeping that much sand airborne and moving requires constant effort, Gaara pointed out. And uses my chakra a lot quicker. The two of them tried various configurations to no avail. Making the funnel bigger didn't help. The farther he was from the moving walls of sand, the slower they went. At a couple of meters away, it wasn't much more than a breeze, and impaired Gaara's sight too much to be useful. In close range, it was at least fast enough to deflect attacks and make it difficult to reach him, but not much else. Gaara let his latest tornado go. This will still require much more training before it is usable in combat, the Sand Genin decided. Let us move on to something else. The Naruto Kijibunshin was pensive, though. Does something come to mind? Gaara asked. You can make a simple disk of sand, right? Gaara nodded, and created one, a simple 2-hand spans wide, just above his fingers. How fast can you make it spin? Quite fast was the answer. It was difficult to put an exact number on it, but it was clearly blurring. Try hitting a rock with that, the clone suggested. Gaara did so. I will admit it is better than my sand bullets, he remarked. A good trick, but nothing groundbreaking. Try from close range instead, Naruto asked. That had a lot more impact. The sand disk shaved through the rock in an instant, leaving a disc-shaped hole in the desert stone. The Naruto clone grimaced. Given what that had done to stone, he didn't want to see what it could do to flesh. That's pretty effective. Gaara, however, wasn't finished. He extended a single sand-armored finger of his right hand toward the rock face and poked. There was a great grinding sound as Gaara's finger sunk right into the stone with a spray of powdered rock. When he removed it, a polished hole was left behind, several centimeters deep. Seeing that, the Kijbunshin had a flash of inspiration. Can you do that with your gauntlets while you fight? He asked. Gaara generated his gauntlets once more and focused. First one, then both of Gaara's arms became covered with a spinning vortex of sand. It does require some concentration, the sand genin pointed out. And I do not see how this is better to attack with than using a disc. He slammed his forearm on the rock face, where it ground into the mineral. It is not very practical. Naruto simply smiled. For attacking, no, it isn't better. For defense, though. Naruto grabbed a rock from the ground and tossed it straight at Gaara's shoulder. He reacted as he'd most recently trained, and made a picture-perfect block in the Konoha Academy style. And the rock ground itself to dust on his gauntlet. Gaara looked at that and grinned a little. I see. Defense and offense at the same time. Naruto nodded. Even better, this forces opponents to be a lot more careful about what they do. It gives you another advantage in close range, which is where your enemies have the most chance of hurting you. Gaara nodded, and launched himself in the first kata of the academy style, keeping the grinding edges of his gauntlets going all the while. Want some opponents? The clone offered. Please, Gaara replied, not deviating from the combat pattern. A wave of Kijbunshin joined the fight not long afterwards. The clone smiled as Gaara fought and eliminated clone after clone. Being a Kij's teacher, he very much liked the sound of that. Prank Day 225. The Naruto clones in the village had done what they did best. That is, they'd spread. When they found no more information at Ishiraku's former insurer, they went and repeated the same process in all of the other businesses owned by the Konoha Merchant Council. Sure, they didn't succeed everywhere. Some places weren't hiring, or had requirements that were difficult to fake. Those they left for later if necessary. But the many places they did infiltrate meant they had piles of data to go through. They did as their teacher had taught them. Follow the money was one of the main precepts that Jiraiya had brought up in regards to seeking out information. This was because someone either paid for something to happen, or profited from it in some way. And profit was very often money. Of course, a couple of dozen businesses had piles of money coming in or out, so it would take a determined army days going on weeks to find anything in all of that. Unfortunately for the Konoha Merchant Council, armies were exactly what it was facing. Got something, one of the many clones said. A few other clones turned around, but most kept on their work. It wasn't the first time a Kijbunshin thought it had found something, only to be wrong. And it probably wouldn't be the last. Show it here, Nico said. As leader of the spy network, he was in charge of this part of the investigation as well. He, like all the others, passed his time poring over the documents recovered by the infiltrators. At least, when he wasn't having class with Jiraiya. The document the clone brought was nothing special, simply the confirmation of a payment made by this insurance company to one of its clients. A sizable payment, true, but outside of that nothing that drew flags. So Nico asked, what's special about this one? This client doesn't exist, the clone pointed out. And that's not all. Continue, Nico said, looking the document over once more. Other clones around them stopped, also curious. The address seems valid, but it isn't. The check number doesn't match to anything else, even though it seems to be in a valid format. And this isn't the only payment made to this customer, the Kijibunshin explained. Show me, Nico said. The clone came back with a pile of documents. A bigger pile than Nico had expected, actually. Nico and said clone went through the entire thing, and were quickly joined by other Narutos that had abandoned their own documents. There were no inspections attached to those supposed insurance payments. No requests, no internal paperwork. Nico would have pegged it as an error or a test document if he'd found one. Only this error had happened dozens of times. Worse were the dates. The original document the clone had found was dated the very day after the Ishiraku arson, and there was one paper dated the very same day the warehouse they'd been using had burned to the ground. It was more than suspicious at this point. That business directly belongs to a council member, you said? Nico asked. The clone nodded. Councilman Yoku, yes. How many people do we have inside? The spy leader asked everyone in the room. Only one, a clone in the back replied. Try to get some more of our people hired, Nico ordered to answering nods. Put the place under surveillance as best we can. Find out more about this councilman Yoku. I want to know everything he does. And if he makes contact with anyone, I want to know. This is the best lead we have, and we're not gonna let go until we shake something loose. All the clones nodded grimly. Like every single Naruto, they wanted blood over what happened to old man Ishiraku. And they'd make sure they were going to get it. Prank Day 227. Tsunade stepped out of Shippo's room, wiping sweat for her brow. While she was still a better healer than her apprentice, there were some things she couldn't do. And surgery was one of them. She cringed just at the thought. The idea of all that blood, of those. Tsunade shook her head. That was in the past, not the present. And she had better stuff to do. Everything fine, Senju-sama? Her ever-present shadow asked. While Tora hadn't left the room Shippo was in, to her knowledge, since she got here, Ryan had appointed himself as her own bodyguard. He was never too far, though never close enough to be in the way. If you forgot that she was one of the Sanin, it even made sense, as Shippo's healer, she was the second most important person in the building. And Tsunade knew Shitsune had her own samurai following her around. Yes, Ryan-san, she replied. Just tired. And then she stumbled. Ryan was at her side instantly, fast enough that if he was a ninja she'd have bet on a shushin. Thank you, she replied, placing her hand on his back for balance. He didn't see her hand flash green for an instant. Tsunade instantly straightened. So, you're the mastermind of all this, she spoke, staring straight in Ryan's eyes. It might have been only a low-powered scan, but it was enough to tell the difference between a clone and a real person. His chakra was also similar to one of the clones, which clearly revealed he was the summoner. There was something bizarre in said chakra, something she knew she should have immediately pegged, but which currently evaded her. Said samurai blanched. Tsunade glared. What's the plot here? A takeover of the country? Did you assassinate the rest of her family? Did one of your men cause those wounds? One thing was sure, this was something big. Her scan had been enough to get a good idea of Ryan's reserves, and he was clearly Hygenin, if not better. And not anybody could use Kichibunshin freely like this man was doing. Not here, Ryan countered. He quickly walked out, going straight for a building Tsunade knew was used as barracks by the samurai group. Still, she followed. They needed her skills as a healer, that was certain given the amount she'd been promised, and she didn't feel endangered by a simple group of samurai whose majority were Kichibunshin. If it came to fighting, they wouldn't last long against one of the Sannin. Ryan led her to one of the smaller rooms, where another pair of samurai were resting. She would need to scan them personally to be certain, but she was pretty sure those two were also clones. What's the issue? The first asked. Tsunade seemed to remember his name was Kyuga, or something like that. She knows, Ryan said, voice grave. The two residents of the room tensed instantly. How? The second asked. Ryan was silent for a moment. I have no clue, actually. Everyone then turned toward Tsunade. She had no real reason to hide what she'd done, nothing had been any form of secret art. I'm a medic and a chakra specialist, I can tell when something's not right in someone, given enough time. After that, a quick scanning palm was all I needed, she explained with a grin. Now, explanations. And remove that henge, too. You noticed that as well. Let's just say I'm very familiar with the technique. Not to mention her short scan had given her enough information to know his form was false. Now, she then exclaimed. She was surprised to see the tall and wide Ryan shrink into a kid. Based on what she knew of her home village, he had to be at least 11, given the leaf hitayet visible on his brow. One thing was sure, it wasn't the powerful Jnin she'd expected. So, talk, Tsunade said, deciding to ignore the fact that she was in front of a kid. Name. I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Tsunade forced herself not to react. She knew who that was, and now that it had been pointed out, she knew what it was in his chakra that she should have recognized. What the hell was the container of the Kaibi doing in a place like this? And what is a leaf ninja doing this far from Konoha, in San no Kuni? What's the mission here? Naruto looked at the two samurai in the room, then nodded. This isn't a ninja mission, Senju-san. This is a mission for the Torazen. And getting Shippo healed is the entirety of that mission. I'm sorry to say, but most of these Torazen are clones like those two. She pointed to the two samurai still seated, who tensed. Shadow clones even, so you can't tell me this isn't ninja business. Why would you pretend to be a group of samurai? Naruto sighed. I just can't say no to someone in need. That was clearly not the answer Tsunade had been expecting. What? The entire story came out then. Why he'd created the Torazen in Wave, and what they did there. The request from Shippo's retainer, and the long march to this country. The weeks of tense patrols, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Shippo's kidnapping and her subsequent rescue, along with their failure to keep her safe. I knew of no other medic I could trust her with, and I knew where you could be found. For a while, I was afraid she wouldn't last until you got here. And that's where we're now. He was silent for an instant. Shippo will make it, right? Right, Tsunade replied automatically, her training coming to the fore. She will most probably require a good amount of physical therapy to recover full mobility, and she might have issues breastfeeding in the future, but her survival isn't in question. The three others in the room released a happy sigh at that. Tsunade's mind, however, was going over everything as fast as it could. She knew very well he hadn't told her everything, especially given he hadn't said how he'd known where to find her. As a medic, however, she knew body language, and the boy before her had given her the truth as he knew it. Give her the scroll, the samurai whose name she didn't know said. Right, Naruto exclaimed, running towards a set of bags. He came back less than a minute later with a rolled scroll bearing the insignia of Konoha, which he then offered to her. Tsunade realized something instantly. This isn't a real scroll. Yeah, Naruto said, scratching the back of his neck. The real thing's still in the village. This is only a shadow clone copy. Keeping one eyebrow up, Tsunade unrolled the scroll and read. This was another thing she hadn't expected, a simple genin with S-ranked orders on his person. You are a genin, correct? She asked. Naruto simply nodded. Thing was, if these orders were fake, they were a better fake than any she'd ever seen. Sarutabi Hiruzen had been her genin teacher, and she knew his signature and his way of writing better than most anyone. And unless Naruto had been fooled himself, and believed something false, he was clearly telling the truth. As such, she decided to play along. And, what are your orders? Tsunade asked. She was curious about what a boy like him could ask with such papers. Anyway, if worst came to worst, she'd just ignore him and continue on as if nothing happened. Just don't tell anybody about this, okay? He waved around the room as he spoke. Nothing about the Torazen being clones or me being there, right? The third does know about this, right? Naruto nodded. I told him myself about the Torazen, and he was present at the last meeting where we went over what was happening in San no Kuni. There was a little evasion here, but Tsunade was still reading everything he said as truth. Which put her in a dilemma. She was technically not a missing nin simply because her sensei had decided not to pursue her. Sure, he sent messengers every few years to try and bring her back to the village, but there was never the threat of force behind those. Tsunade knew that there were some lines she wasn't supposed to cross, and that was why she'd not involved herself in any ninja business. Just to make sure that the third wouldn't push too hard to bring her back. And now something like this fell into her lap. You're not under any order to bring me back, aren't you? Naruto shook his head negatively. I heal Shippo, get my payment, and everything is square between us, right? No bad blood, and I can leave any time I want after that. Sure, Naruto exclaimed. That's a promise, and you can believe it. He extended his hand to shake. Tsunade sighed. However he'd found her, he'd done it at least twice, of that she was certain. While she was pretty sure she could escape at any time, she'd be leaving behind the biggest payoff she'd had in a long time. And she hated leaving some of her work half done. Not to mention how much Shitsune would complain about leaving someone like Shippo without her services. She would have to take the risk. She grasped Naruto's hand and shook twice, not using any of her super strength. You have a deal, she said. Just know that if you betray me, you'll find out what it is to fight one of the Sannin. He shook his head quickly. I already had a Sannin fight against me once, he said, shuddering, and that was more than enough for a single lifetime. Tsunade wanted to push for more information about that, but unfortunately a voice rang through the Torazen's barracks. Tsunade-sama, I'm done with the surgery. Please come and do your checkup as soon as possible. She sighed and turned to leave. We'll discuss this later. Is that fine with you? Right, Naruto replied. Then he made a single hand seal, and Ryan was back in the room. Tsunade simply left. She was one of the greatest medics in the land, and one did not become so by leaving things to chance. While she trusted her apprentice to have done good work, the longer she waited before checking, the worse any subsequent issue would be. And she had to agree that Noble Kid was slowly growing on her. Prank Day 230. No, Naruto, I will not be sending your team to the Chunin exams, the Hokage exclaimed, sighing. I had told you so, Naruto Ebisu pointed out. Why? Naruto countered, ignoring his sensei. We're ready. We're more than ready. We did all the missions we need, and even more than Team 7 had when they took the exam. That's not it, Naruto. Then why aren't we good enough? The blonde genin continued, waving to his team. Both Myumru and Iruka were looking intently at the village leader, also awaiting an answer. The next Chunin exam is in Iwagakure. Hiruzen sighed once more. I know you followed the last exam. Tell me, how many teams from Earth Country were present for that exam? Naruto stepped back to think for a moment. I don't remember any, actually. The Sundame nodded. Correct. There wasn't an Earth team in the last exam, nor in any of the previous for the last 10 years. Do you how many teams I'm planning to send to the exam in stone? I don't know. 4, I suppose. The blonde answered. That was the number of Mist Village teams there had been in Konoha's exam. None. What? Naruto replied, shocked. The two other genin in the room had similar reactions. I am not sending any genin team to Earth Country, the Hokage repeated. Not for this exam, nor for any in the future. There hasn't been a genin team sent there in a decade, at least. Why? Naruto whined, face dropping. May I, Hokage-sama? Ebisu asked, stepping forward. You may. A little more than a decade ago was the time of the last great ninja war, Ebisu recited. The Third Shinobi War, to be exact. Many villages fought each other, but none more viciously than Konoha and Iwa. The latter invaded Grass Country, hoping to lay siege to the Land of Fire. The fighting was long and hard, but Minato Namikaze, the man who would become the fourth Hokage, broke the stalemate. Using his legendary speed as the Yellow Flash, he led counterattacks that inflicted heavy casualties against Iwa, crippling or eliminating half the Iwa force. He then looked at all three genin in turn. And Iwa has not forgotten their loss. Indeed they haven't, Hiruzen said. And that is why no genin teams are sent to Earth Country. Similarly, we do not send team to the exam in Lightning Country, given the still recent fighting between Konoha and Kumo. But, that could mean. Iruka started. No, the Sundame countered, knowing full well what she was thinking of. The next exam after this one is in Water Country, followed by Suna's exam, and I will be sending teams to both. You need not fear for chances to prove yourselves, you will have as many as you need. He smiled. I wouldn't have given your sensei a task he couldn't accomplish, after all. Naruto was silent for a moment. You promise, Chiji? I promise. Your team will be one of those sent to the Kirigakyo exam, and to sooner if it becomes necessary. Right. Naruto said, once again all smiles. What did you want to see us for, Chiji? Hiruzen echoed Naruto's smile. I have here another C-rank mission for your team. This one isn't like the last one, being a... Jiraiya shook his head. Clearly, there was something bothering his student tonight, and it made for an unproductive jutsu training session. What's bothering you, Naruto? The genin scowled. I should be a knin already, he answered. Jiraiya sat down in front of his student. What brought that on? The third isn't sending anyone to the next knin exams, Naruto pointed out. In Earth. Thank the gods. The Sannin exclaimed. He'd be a fool to do so. The village has enough problems with Earth teams during Mitsu's exam, I wouldn't want to see how bad it would be on their home ground. He paused for a second. I mean, why do you think that? Hinata started years after me, as did Shino, both are now already knin. That's not counting those of the previous class, or the one before, the blonde explained. There's people I went to class with that are now at their fourth exam, while I have to wait another 6 months for a chance. That's not fair. Unfortunately, life is rarely about fair, Jiraiya countered. And while the fact that it took you years to get where you are is sad, it is better than the alternative. How? Well, let's say you passed on your first attempt. Let's even say you passed your Chunin's test. The Sannin said. Test. Normally, Chunin have the right to refuse the team they've been given, Jiraiya continued, and they test the genin that fall under their umbrella for the values they find important in a ninja, and fail them if they don't make the cut. I understand Kakashi was famous for doing just that before he passed Team 7. You were a special case, given that you were promoted outside the exams directly by the Hokage. But, no matter. You passed that test too. How good a shinobi would you be? The Toad Hermit asked. Would you be as good as you are now? Naruto had to admit he couldn't be sure. Sure, having a couple more years under a good Chunin sensei might have made him good enough to be knin, but he wouldn't be the same person. He wouldn't know the Kichibunshin, that was certain, and that was such an important part of everything he did that he had no clue what he would be without it. What do you think? He asked his teacher. Jiraiya shook his head. No chance. You're a one-of-a-kind shinobi right now, and there's no way you could have ended up the same. Sure, it took you a while to get there, but do you regret what happened? Meeting Iruka, the rabbits, all the people your clones got close to. He was silent for a moment. Not to mention Konoha might not be standing now if it wasn't for your clone army. Naruto cringed at that. He had to agree with Jiraiya that Konoha's fall might have been a possibility. Nobody but he managed to take that barrier down, and his clones had eliminated dozens if not hundreds of opponents. Even if Konoha had still stood without him, the damage would have been extensive. On average, Jiraiya continued, a genin is promoted during his third or fourth exam. Most that break this pattern are promoted at home, which is where they have the most advantage. Fourth. Jiraiya nodded. Yup. Those that do it in less usually skipped an exam or two. Think about it, how many of the Konoha teams even reached the third exam last time? 3. Hinata's team, Rock Lee's team, and Shikamaru's team. Out of how many? A lot. More genin teams than Naruto had known Konoha had, actually. The genin didn't have to say anything, his face was more than enough. Think about it this way, it's another 6 months to get ready to pass. Are you a better ninja than you were 6 months ago? Definitely. Then I don't doubt at least one of your identities will pass in mist. And that's if you're unlucky and end up fighting yourselves early, Jiraiya exclaimed, sure of himself. Naruto shook himself, and rose. He wasn't someone who liked focusing on the sad side of events. Not when there was something he could do about it. He rose. So, what's the best way to ensure I pass? Jiraiya had been a Genin sensei once, and a Genin himself at one point. He had to know what a Genin faced. Well, I can't say much about the first 2 exams, since they change every time, but the last is always a one-on-one fighting tournament, the Sannin explained. Winning isn't necessary, though it sure helps. Any tips? Pulling out new techniques seems to help the most, as well as effective strategy and tactics. He paused. Which actually brings me to a subject I was planning to talk to you about. Yes. New techniques. From what I heard, you haven't had much luck with the Scroll of Forbidden Seals in finding new things to train in, correct? Jiraiya asked. Naruto nodded. Most of the jutsu that could be found in the scroll were there for a good reason, and those that were safe weren't any real improvement over what they already had. Right. So I had 2 things in mind. First, the Sannin raised his hand, and a spiraling sphere of chakra appeared there. The Rasengan. That's the technique you used to defeat Shuken, Naruto replied. I'm not about to forget it. Exactly. It's a powerful piercing technique, and always a crowd pleaser, Jiraiya explained. You'd have to only use it as Naruto, since I'm pretty much the last person who knows it, but it would be a big help if you're ever stuck in a situation like before. Naruto smiled widely at the idea. And the other point? He asked after a moment of silence. Creating your own jutsu, the Toad Sage said. Every great ninja ends up doing that, and is pretty much a given at high ranks. Most don't start this early, but with the numbers you have it'd be a waste not to. By that point, Naruto was nearly salivating. His own techniques. He knew the previous Hokages had created many of them, and it was a great step on that path. How does that go? He exclaimed, creating a clone the very next instant. Said clone disappeared, then reappeared with pen and paper in hand, sitting down right beside its creator. I see you're interested, Jiraiya pointed out with a smile. Well, first you have to start with Prank Day 232. To most, Kusako was a newly arrived merchant, who'd fled the big city to make money in the very deepest parts of grass. Some said that she was escaping an unwanted marriage, others thought that her beau had spurned her, and she had left the capital in tears only to make the best of her situation in the deep prairies. Of course none of them had it right. Kusako was a Naruto clone, one that was part of the merchant network. She was the only clone in this particular city, trading mainly in Kusa tobacco and a few medicinal herbs that could be found close to her place of residence. However, she had also a second, very important role. That role was why, every Friday of the year, rain or shine, she went for a walk through the city's park. She took her time doing so, and often took her lunch at the foot of the statue there, an ancient carving of a former daimyo of the country. Only those who knew the Naruto clones well would have noticed Kusako's reaction that day. Still, she acted as she did usually, eating her sandwich with her back to the stone. Then she went back to work, and nobody saw anything abnormal about what had happened. But that night at midnight, when everyone was asleep in the town, She was back in the park and in front of the statue. That was her second role. Here in Kuzucho, deep within grass, was the spot given by Zabuza as a contact point. The sign indicating a waiting message was very simple and very easy to ignore, a single blade of grass stuck between the stone fingers of the statue. On one side to give a message, on another if an answer was awaiting. And a message was waiting. She snuck to the back of the statue, easily finding the slit in the stone that had been carved there. She slid out the piece of paper therein, slipping it into the pockets of her suit. And then she rushed back home, closed the door behind her, and lit a single candle to read the message. Only, there was someone with her in the room. I was starting to wonder if I would have to wait another day, the voice said. Kusako had no clue how this person had managed to slip inside unnoticed, especially in the subdued floral kimono they were wearing. The clone did, however, recognize them from the memories of their mission in Wave. You're Haku, right? The Kichibunshin asked, just to confirm. The androgynous figure nodded. And, based on the fact that you are a clone, I suppose you're another member of the so-called Hidden Spirit Village, as rumor would call it. Kusako nodded. The network was well aware of the name they'd been given by the few survivors who escaped, and had seen no reason to quash it. It was another layer of misdirection that kept people from looking for them in Konoha, and that was fine. Haku seated themselves at the table. You may read the message now. The clone had nearly forgotten about that. Kusako snuck the message out of the pocket it was in, and quickly read it. It had all the necessary code words, but outside of that it had very little content. Haku will have your message, it said. It also gave an encrypted password to recite to the contact. The Kichibunshin turned back to her visitor and did so. You're my message, then. Indeed, they said. I have a request from my master, and from my master's master. They are wondering if the forces that took down Gato's soldiers could be hired for a mission. Kusako was surprised by that. Haku, from what little the clones knew, was high Nin at the very least, and their master was stronger than any regular Nin for certain. And that was not even counting the two other members of their group. She couldn't see what mission these two would have that they couldn't do by themselves. Still, protocol had to be followed. This was way above Kusako's mandate, and as such was a question for a meeting of those in the know. I'll need more information than that if you want to get a positive answer, she explained, because I'm pretty sure that, as it is, you're gonna get a simple no. Haku nodded and invited Kusako to sit, which she did. The water rebels are looking for help, they started. You are aware of the situation in Mitsu? Some. Well, ever since the last Mitsukage has been. Prank Day 234. While the meetings of those in the know weren't always fully attended, this one was short on more people than usual. This was unsurprising, given that this meeting had been called in a hurry and Team 1 was on a C-ranked mission at the borders of the Land of Fire. Still, Naruto had once more made the journey from San no Kuni to Konoha to preside over this meeting, even if the council was already missing 5 members. The message they had was that important. Welcome to the latest meeting of those in the know, Naruto said from his spot at the end of the council table. There's only one subject today, and that is the request we received from Grass Country's merchant network, he continued, mostly for the non-clone members of the council. Which is? Iruka asked. Naruto turned to the clone in charge of the western part of the merchant network, who rose. The Mitsu rebels are looking to hire a number of members of the Hidden Spirit Village to support their operations in preparation for and leading up to an attempt at taking down the 4th Mitsukage, the clone explained. reading from a scroll that had traveled straight to Konoha from Kuzucho by Jumper. The Hidden Spirit Village. The Chuanin replied, curious. That was the nickname given to the forces who took down Gato in Wave, of which I was part. Nico answered proudly. We could easily create a large enough force to help, that's for certain, he added. Creating more clones isn't an issue here, Jiraiya continued. The main question is, do you want to get involved in something like that? This is a civil war you're talking about, and those are never any good even when they are necessary. Are you sure you want to take part in that? I'm not, and that's why I'm asking, Naruto replied. I don't know what's best in this case, for either Konoha or Mitsu. The network hasn't spread much in that direction, and they tend to stay out of ninja villages unless otherwise specified. One thing is sure, I'm not planning on setting foot in Mist myself anytime soon, unless a mission sends me that way. Any opinions? He asked the non-clones around the table. There was a moment of silence before Hiruzen finally spoke up. I don't have much information on the water rebels themselves, but the current Mitsukage is another issue. He's currently the youngest of the 4 living Kages, and has ruled for surprisingly long considering his age. Unfortunately, that isn't a good thing, Jiraiya pointed out. Explain. Naruto asked. There are reasons why Mist Village is currently in a state of civil war, Jiraiya continued. Yagura, the 4th Mitsukage, is a hard and cruel man, and somewhat paranoid at best. He's more feared than respected in Mist, and he hunts down whoever he suspects is a traitor bloodily and relentlessly. He also did nothing to oppose the bloodline purges that have been happening in Mist, and him staying his hand has been taken by most as tacit approval of removing the bloodline-carrying clans from the country. Hiruzen nodded. Yes. 3 bloodline clans are already known to have defected from Mist, 2 of them to Kumo and 1 to Iwa. 4, Jiraiya corrected. The few remaining Ryugawa have left Kiri last month. They haven't resettled anywhere, which is why the news hasn't spread yet. 4, then the Hokage amended. There are those who fear that, once Kiri has finally pushed away or eliminated all of the bloodline clans inside their own borders, they'll turn to the other villages with theirs and start the next great ninja war. A war could start that easily? Naruto asked. Both the Hokage and Jiraiya nodded sadly. Unfortunately, yes, the former pointed out. It only takes one village attacking another, and the wars would start all over again. The only reason a war didn't start when Sand and Sound invaded was that Konoha and Suna were nominally allies, and because it happened and ended so fast nobody really had time to react. Konoha won decisively enough that Kumo didn't want to get involved, and both Iwa and Kiri weren't ready, the former not having yet recovered from the end of the previous war, and the latter too involved in the issue we're talking about right now. The grudges that led to the Third Shinobi War still haven't faded, and there are still hot embers ready to fan the flames of battle once more. Naruto digested that for a moment. So, you're saying that this civil war could lead to another Shinobi one? Both Jiraiya and Hiruzen nodded in confirmation. Yes, and that on both sides of the issue. If the rebels win, they may weaken the current stalemate enough that one of the other great powers takes a shot at them, while even if the current Mitsukage maintains his rule the same could happen. That is not to speak of the lesser powers that could see the current turbulences as an opportunity to steal the seat of one of the 5 powers. There was another moment of silence. So, what you're saying is that the best case scenario for maintaining the current peace is for the rebels to end this war as decisively as possible, and with the least amount of losses, correct? Naruto asked. Pretty much, the Sannin admitted. It may be that nothing can stop the beginning of a fourth Shinobi War, but that's the scenario where peace has the most chance. There was a moment of silence. I'm going, then Naruto concluded. I at least want to see what these water rebels are like. Maybe they are no better than the current Kiri leadership, or even worse, but I don't lose anything by listening to them. You're not thinking of you going, right? Iruka asked, and the emphasis on the you was clear. I have to agree with that opinion, the Hokage added, and the Sannin nodded beside him. Naruto shook his head. No worries, he replied. I wasn't planning to. The Hidden Spirit Village is well known to field clones only, and I'm not going to take the risk. Not to mention that he was going back to San no Kuni as soon as the meeting was done. After what had happened to Shippo on his watch, he wasn't willing to take the risk of something else harming her. Iruka sighed in relief. Thank God for that. That broke whatever tension was there. Anyway, from what my sources tell me, the Mitsu rebels are a lot more reasonable than the current administration. They are heavy in bloodline users, of course, but outside of that they are closer to actual Konoha policy than any time before. Any other information you have? Naruto asked. Nothing I can see as useful, unfortunately, the sage admitted. I'll have to reach out to my sources for more. Please do. He paused. Is there any other subject that can't wait until the regular meeting? Naruto then asked. There was a chorus of negative answers. Meeting adjourned, then he said. Next meeting will be scheduled when Team 1 returns from the border. He then banged his gavel, and the meeting broke up. Prank Day 239. As a Naruto clone, he was nameless. He was actually one of the older clones, created during the second wave of technique training. He was part of the group who'd originally chosen the Earth technique Sachiani no Tsuno, and who'd failed to make any significant progress during the entire time of the competition. After that he'd flitted here and there, mainly working in the technique library they'd been building. He'd ended up as part of the wave of new technique training, and was actually still training in the specific jutsu he'd chosen. But now, for the first time since the invasion, it seemed a mission called. The original isn't available, Nico said, standing before the assembled clones in the Uruhara basement. So we need 4 clones to step up. For those who don't know, my team and I have been working on finding out who burnt down Ishiraku Ramen. There was a growl at that, and who has been going after our suppliers. We don't have exact details on the who yet. From what the information we have points to the fact that they are linked to the Konoha Merchant Council, who has at least been funding said group, paying for such attacks. The Naruto council member looked around to make sure he had everyone's attention. And a new payment has just been filed for said group, one greater than the one made when Ishiraku burned down. Jiraiya agrees with me that this is probably the precursor to another wave of attacks on our suppliers. As such, we need reinforcements helping the network make sure we don't lose more of our sources. This is, in effect, a defend and capture mission, he explained. Protect our people, and capture whoever is responsible for this. We need information, so either people we can interrogate, or enough info that we can find where they are based from. If not, we're going to be stuck in this cycle for a long time, and while Jiraiya is pretty certain we'll win in the end, better to cut down the losses as much as possible. There were nods all around. So, anyone willing to take part? Nico called out. The nameless clone stepped forward. Given the subject of his latest studies, that seemed right in his branch, and that might actually allow him to prove he'd mastered his latest technique. He, of course, wasn't the only one. Dozens stepped up, and were split into squads after making as many clones as they could. Time was of the essence. They had no clue how long before said attack happened, and no idea on the actual target or targets. They need to protect everywhere, and that soonest. And they weren't going to fail again. Prank Day 243. Hinata walked down the step to the Imitsu compound with a smile. She had a day off, and she was going to spend it as she preferred. That is, spending time with Naruto. She'd been meeting him here every time she had a day off, and he'd never failed in helping her become a better ninja. Over the last few months, they'd worked on a close combat style that she could use in conjunction with the Matsuri, and they'd made good strides on that. And, hopefully, they'd do some more today. With her eyes, she saw the half-dozen Naruto clones long before she arrived inside the room they used for training. She didn't mind the clones. A ninja's life was a busy one, and she understood that he had other priorities. That just made the few times the real Naruto was there more special. "Good day, Naruto-san," she called out as she entered the training room. "Aho, Hinata." The group called back. "Here for more training." "Hi," she said with a bow. "I have the day off, and continuing work on the mastery no Odori seems the best use of my time." She paused. "Is the real Naruto available?" The clone before her shook his head. "Team 1 has a border patrol mission," he explained, to which she nodded. Then the clone paused, clearly thinking. She waited until he'd finished his thought. "Did you know we were all clones?" "Hi," she confirmed with a nod. "How could you tell?" She was the one who paused this time. Trying to explain the details of what she saw with her Bakugan had never been easy, and even now the teams she worked it had issues with that. "It's about how your chakra moves. Fluctuates. Flows." She tried explaining. "Living people have a pattern to them, an order in which their energy circulates. For clones it's different, and if you know what you're looking for it's reasonably easy to notice. It still took me a while to get it, but by now it's second nature." The clone thought some more. "Do you think it could be faked?" She now saw what the clone was working toward. Unfortunately, she couldn't say much about the idea. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe different sensors see it differently anyway. It would probably take quite strong chakra control, though." She thought about it for a second. "It might make a good training exercise, actually. I'd be happy to help if you want to try." "Might be something to think about in the future," the clone before her replied, "but that's not why you're here today." "How many clones do you think you can manage today, Hinata?" She smiled brightly. "I'm fully rested, so as many as you need, sensei." It did help that all this training had pushed her reserves far beyond what they'd been before she became a Chunin. He smiled back. "Give me 5, and we'll work in parallel." He turned to the rest of the clones. 2 swords, 2 fists, 2 kunai?" he asked them. "Seems fine," one of the clones answered while the rest nodded in approval. He turned to her. "Your show, then." Her hands flashed into a cross. "Kijibunshin no Jutsu," she called out. And the battle was joined. Prank Day 247. Tiki didn't know what to think of the network, as they called themselves. It wasn't that they didn't follow through on what they promised. No, it was the very opposite. The very day after he'd signed on with them, he had the money to rebuild Ishiraku Ramen in hand. And not just to rebuild. He had enough to expand, and the funds necessary to rent a better spot. He had all he wanted, and better even. And that was the issue. He'd been in business for years, and from his experience businessmen simply did not work like that. They cut all the corners they could, skimming all the margins just to get a little more money in their pockets. And the network didn't do any of that. They had no problems making promises and keeping them, and when they said something you could take it to the bank. He'd worked for them nearly 2 months at this point, and he'd seen this half a dozen times over. Still, it surprised him. When he'd signed on, he'd expected to be a figurehead, a member in name only, existing just for his contacts and no other reason. If that allowed him to bring Ishiraku ramen back, he was fine with that. The shop had been his life, and he'd always expected to leave it to his daughter. Being a figurehead was a sacrifice he was willing to make. But it hadn't been the case. No, he was clearly an equal member here, and he had no clue why. Whenever there was a meeting, his voice carried as much weight as anyone else, and he could tell that everyone was listening intently. They'd said it was personal, now, he was starting to believe it. Either that or the network was planning things at the very long term, in decades or more. He couldn't see the network making profits before then. That, however, didn't seem to stop them. In weeks they spent millions of Rio arranging that the last few banking and insurance companies in Konoha didn't fall under the umbrella of the Merchant Council, and also buying up transportation infrastructure in the villages closest to Konoha. Lastly, he'd been questioned on the various businesses the members of the Merchant Council owned, and he was pretty sure they were planning something big there. He'd bet his hand on it. Still, for the moment, he was fine with the work he was doing. He was the face of the group in Konoha, as they'd said, and had recruited others tired of the machinations of the council. It wasn't nearly enough yet, but the more businessmen joined, the better it looked for the rest. He was even in talks with one of the less active members of the council over joining the network. And if one did, there might be others who'd see the way the wind was blowing. He'd been in Konoha for decades, and had seen the rise of the Merchant Council from the advisory group it was in his youth to the economic powerhouse that it was now. And, right now, it seemed like he'd get to see them fall. From what he'd seen on how they did business and what proof he'd been shown of their actions, he couldn't wait for it to happen. Prank Day 252. Haku was glad to be back in Kiri. He'd been traveling in that direction for more than 2 weeks at this point, and even he was starting to get tired. And that was not to mention the Hidden Spirit Village members accompanying him. Kusako, the informant he'd been tasked with contacting, had passed the message up the chain just as he'd expected. He'd been prepared to wait days or even possibly weeks until a reply came, as per his orders. 2 days later, there was another clone with Kusako, and he was leaving Kuzucho, accompanying the new Hidden Spirit Village ninja directly to the Water Rebels. This journey was the first time he was in the presence of spirit ninjas for long periods of time, and given his senses he couldn't help but pick up details. And they didn't make sense. These ghost ninjas, as he was starting to call them in his mind, didn't make sense. Their chakra fluctuated abnormally for both what types of clones he knew and for normal ninjas, sometimes diminishing rapidly, sometimes doing the very opposite. And it didn't help when other such ghosts joined the group. They joined while on the run, coming up as if expected. There was no stopping, no salutations, no nothing. They just fell in line as if they'd long been anticipated, and kept pace as if they belonged. It was eerie. Still, he thought as he saw the hill in the distance, his part was finally over. He slowed down as the group approached the caverns he'd been told would be used as a meeting point, and the clones he was accompanying did the same a second later. Then he guided them in. This place wasn't a rendezvous point in common use, but he'd made sure to be familiar with it before leaving with Mai's message. As such, he let the 12 ghosts into the earth, navigating through both the natural maze and the illusions embedded in the very walls. Still, he kept ready. He didn't think Mai would be in danger from this group, based on their reactions, but one could never be too certain in such a case. In the end, they arrived in a room that, unlike the rest of the place, had clearly been shaped by human hands. 3 people were waiting there, and Haku was glad to see that his master was one of them. Mai-sama, Zabuza-sama, Chjr-san, may I present you the members of the Hidden Spirit Village, he intoned. Shinobi of the Hidden Spirit Village, the leader of the Water Rebels, Mai-term, her bodyguard, Chjr, and my master Zabuza, who you've already met. Greetings, Mai stated, while Zabuza grunted and Chjr stood silent. One of the ghosts stepped forward and bowed slightly. Good day, Shinobi-san. What should I call you? Mai will be fine, she replied. So, Mai-san, what can the Hidden Spirit Village do for you, he asked. How much would it cost us to hire your services? She asked. Depends on what you want us to do, and what you offer, the lead ghost replied. Along with your plans once this rebellion succeeds. Mai took a seat in one of the chairs in the room, and gestured for the ghost to do the same. Let's start with the easier one, she started answering. My goal for this rebellion is to rebuild Kirigakyo, and to reclaim the strength needed to let the village hidden in the mist keep its position as one of the 5 great villages. Currently, Kiri is a hotbed of paranoia, with illusions of treachery everywhere. The current Mitsukage rules through terror, and woe betide anyone he sees as a potential enemy. He trusts no one, and his methods are unnecessarily bloody, which is sapping the potential of our village. This environment creates new ninjas just as paranoid and untrusting, making the problem self-perpetuating. And how would you make Kiri stronger? The clone asked. Changes to the academy for a start. It isn't as bad as it was in the past, but it still needs improvement, she explained. Modifications to the laws and greater investigation to erode the atmosphere of paranoia. New alliances to strengthen the village and give it time to recover from the rebellion. In general, make the village more of a meritocracy than it currently is, and stand down on more of the bloodier policies. The clones looked at each other and nodded. That fit their preferences, more Kira-centric than they had in mind, but that was a given. Also, once the fighting is all done, I'm finding myself a husband, she added as an afterthought, and based on the reactions of her fellow rebels, it wasn't the first time she'd made such a comment. What the rebels need Spirit Village for is actually simple, numbers and infiltration, she continued. The water rebels are skewed toward the higher ranks, mostly jonins, special jonins, and high chuanins. We are more than strong enough to tackle the Mitsukage and his guard with good chances of victory. The lower ranks re the problems, Abuser interjected with a scowl, to which Mai nodded. If fighting starts in the village, and it quite probably will, she continued, the Genin and Chuanin will take a disproportionate amount of casualties compared to the higher ranks. This could set back Kiri years if not a full decade in a worst-case scenario. Every rank and file ninja we remove from the fighting bloodlessly is another possible future jonin. Every casualty we prevent makes the village better placed to survive after the coup. So you're not planning on having Reinin fighting against the Mitsukage himself? The lead clone asked. Not particularly, Mai admitted. I'm planning on taking on Yagura myself, possibly with some of the other rebels. Sure, we wouldn't stop the Reinins from joining in, but I'd actually prefer you saving as many of the Genin and Chuanin as possible. Depending on spirit ninjas for the meat of the fighting D make us look weak, Zabuza added with a growl. Mai nodded at that. As for price, I doubt we can offer you enough money to make it worth your while. While we're not poor, we have nothing close to the resources that someone like Gato had. However, we can put other things on the table: access to the Mitsu archives, training in various techniques, a set number of A or S-ranked missions, even some of the Kiri treasures that the village has accumulated over the past decades. Discussing the details and specifics will probably take a while, but do you think we can agree in principle? The Naruto clone in charge nodded. To be fair, the main things they wanted was to prevent another Shinobi war, the rest was icing on the cake. Still, he planned to negotiate as best he could. Appearing cheap would weaken the reputation of the group and they'd just end up with other people trying to abuse of their generosity. We can. Mai smiled and extended her hand. It may be a little early, but welcome to the Mitsu rebels. We're glad to have you. They shook. Prank Day 262. Given Naruto's skill at the Shadow Clone, a border patrol mission was an easy task. Still, that didn't mean he hadn't taken things seriously. Between the various checks and surveys he had his team do on their length of the border, Ibisu taught the classics of such a mission: how to patrol efficiently, how to identify important areas, how to check for passers-by, the usual lessons a team got on their first border mission. Still, such a mission along with Naruto's army on demand meant that it was easy to arrange for extra training, like the sparring his 3 students were doing right at this moment. And he was paying close attention to said spar from his perch. He had a persistent itch that needed scratching. He was still stuck over the fact that his team either had an infiltrator or a guardian angel. He'd been paying extra attention to everyone since they'd arrived on the grass border, hoping to catch this Anbu member unaware, but nothing on that front. No unexplained tracks, no bizarre shadows, no eyes in the distance. So, he was currently leaning more towards infiltrator than anything else. He'd looked toward Iruka at first, given her lightning affinity, but if she was a fake genin, she was a better actress than anyone he'd ever seen. She made mistakes understandable of a genin, but ones that a better trained ninja would have difficulty performing, even on purpose. Instincts were what they were, and managing the illusion in the middle of combat was difficult. Still, there were other details he noticed, which amounted to a massive number of puzzle pieces that didn't fit together. He had an example right before him. Below, in the clearing the team had claimed as a base, Team 1 was fighting a trio of his shadow clones. To make things more challenging, Naruto had been forbidden from using the Kichibunshin, so it was 3-on-3. And, as the fake ninjutsu specialist of the opposing team sent forth a wave of flame-hiding blunted shurikens, all 3 dodged. And did so the exact same way. It wasn't the first time that Ibisu had noted something like this. Yes, it was common for teammates to have some moves in common, as they picked up on each other's styles, but Team 1 pushed it farther. A lot farther. They had similar stances, similar evasion patterns, even similar tics and reactions, sometimes. And they hadn't been a team for a year yet. That attracted his attention, but that was the opposite of what an infiltrator would do. Sure, keeping to the level of the team was necessary, but imitating them to that point would be counter to their plans. Again, Iruka doing a parry on a kunai, a picture-perfect sharp fist block. Normally, he'd take that as a fluke, but after more than a dozen times that excuse felt weak. But he'd verified, and there wasn't any other sharp fist user left in the village, so it couldn't be her being an infiltrator. Then Myungru was twisted aside by the man who'd grappled with him, and he took a fireball to the side. "Stop!" he called out, and Shu shined right beside his wounded student. Everyone had frozen in place, and Ebisu ordered one of his clones to go grab the first aid kit without even looking at him. He was too busy with Myungru. Taking out a kunai, he quickly removed the boy's smoldering shirt off of him. Leaving it there would only make the burns under it. There were no burns. He froze at the sight. Under his shirt, Myungru had pristine skin, without any trace of damage. In fact, his skin wasn't even hot, just the warmth of someone doing physical exercise, not that of chakra-fueled flames. That was impossible. His eyes rose, and Ebisu noticed the boy's hair. There wasn't even a burned end in sight, which made no sense. Hair burned so easily. There were dozens of fire users, such as he had when much younger, who'd burned their own locks by mistake. There wasn't even the quite recognizable smell that burning hair had. "Kai!" Ebisu called out, sending a surge of chakra Myungru's way. There was no change, so it wasn't an illusion. Now that he thought about it, he'd never seen his team wounded, save superficial scratches. He racked his head for anything like that, and finally remembered Naruto bleeding from a few slices that quickly closed, but nothing from his other two students. And that was the last drop. "Sit down," he called out, and he was happy that his team obeyed without hesitation. "Explain this." "What?" Myungru replied, clearly trying to pretend nothing was wrong. Ebisu didn't fall for it. "You took a fireball to the shoulder, and there's no hint of anything on you. Is it my fault that fireball was weak?" he retorted. "It was strong enough to burn your shirt, so your hair should be a mess," the teacher continued. "And that's not all." He chucked the kunai he was still holding straight at the side of Iruka's head, who slapped it aside instinctively. "That's a perfect sharp fist block," Ebisu added, "and you're not even bleeding, regardless of the fact this wasn't a blunted kunai that you blocked with your bare arm." He glared down at his three students. "Outside Naruto, I've never seen a drop of blood or wound on any of you," he ranted. "No one manages to get out unscathed from training that way. No one. Only Naruto's clones." He froze. Only clones would be that undamaged, as clones would vanish before taking wounds like that. And Naruto was probably the most talented person in the village at the Kichibunshin. Still, that made no sense. He'd have noticed if his students had been replaced by clones one day. There wasn't a town in miles, so there was no real reason for some of his students to play hooky. What was going on here? "Are you all clones?" he asked, and saw all three of his students flinch, then look at each other. That set his mind up. "I'm not moving from this until you all explain to me what's going on. This has gone long enough, and either I'm getting an explanation from you, or from the Hokage in 3 days when we arrive back in Konoha." Ebisu glared at them again. "So, what's it going to be?" That's it, guys. Hope you like the video. Like, share and subscribe the channel, and also make sure you tell me your recommendation in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching.